I'm Mark Massoud, Professor of Politics and Director of Legal Studies at UC Santa Cruz in California. Can everyone hear me okay? I'd love to see a thumbs up from people if you can hear me okay. If you can't, just let me know, say something in the chat, and I'll turn off my video. I've had some problems, like everyone has, cutting in and out. So just let me know if you can't hear anything, and then I'll turn off my video, and we'll keep going. So welcome to the How To Conference panel, sponsored by the Law and Society Association. When I was getting started on the academic train, I basically showed up to my first conference in grad school, not really knowing what to expect, not really knowing how things worked, maybe just talking with my advisor or seeing them at conferences and trying to kind of emulate them like a child would emulate a parent in a way. I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't know what I'm doing. And I thought recently, after attending conferences for nearly 20 years, wouldn't it be nice if there were a session where people could just talk openly about conference attendance and what it means and what it's like and our experiences, and just an open space for people to ask questions about conferences. And so that's how the idea of this How To Conference panel was born. So I want to welcome all of you here. You're taking a great first step by being here just to listen, ask questions, share your experiences if you have any. It's 8 a.m. or about 8:07 in the morning here in the Pacific coast of the United States. Many of you are in different time zones. I would love to hear from people on the chat, or if you're willing to write in the chat where you're coming from, like where, if you're in the US, what city and state, if you're in a different country, what city and country, just throw it into the chat where you are so that we could see the amazing global diversity of people who are here today, and just welcome people from all over the place. This is, as we join together today, I know some of you are already vaccinated. Some of you are in places where you're feeling some relief. Others of you are in places where the pandemic continues to ravage communities that you are a part of, that you know and love. And so I extend my own thoughts and prayers to all of you who are continuing to hurt by the unrelenting path of this virus. And I want to welcome everyone from the many countries that I see in the chat across the world in this spirit of respect and community, and learning together and moving forward to the extent we can right now. So that said, I want to introduce our panelists. I'm really delighted that they're here today. And so I have 4 panelists lined up for you. And I'm going to ask them some questions. The plan is I'm going to introduce them, then ask them some questions, and then just leave space for all of you to ask what questions that you'd like to ask of the panelists, or share some stories towards the end. So the first person I want to introduce is Fabio de Sá e Silva. Fabio is Assistant Professor of International Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He holds a BA in Legal Studies from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, a Master's of Law from the University of Brasilia, and a PhD in Law Policy and Society from Northeastern University. Fabio is pretty awesome. He writes and publishes in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. His edited volume, called Global Pro Bono, is out this year with Cambridge University Press. The next person I want to introduce is Swetha Balakrishnan. Swetha is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine, here on the Pacific coast of the United States. They are co-director of the Center for Empirical Research on the Legal Profession. Professor Balakrishnan is also the author of a new book, Accidental Feminism, which is out this year from Princeton University Press, and co-editor of another new book called Invisible Institutionalisms, which is out this year from Hart Publishing. The next person I'll introduce is Jeffrey Omari, who goes by Omari. Omari is Assistant Professor of Law at Northern Illinois University. He holds a PhD in anthropology from UC Santa Cruz, a JD from the University of Illinois, and a BA from Morehouse College. His work examines internet governance in Brazil, where he conducted 18 months of ethnographic field research, both in the favelas, which are informal low-income communities in Brazil, and in Brazil's top law schools. And the next person I want to introduce is Beth Hoffman. Beth Hoffman is Associate Professor of Sociology at Purdue University in Indiana. She's the author of too many articles to list on labor, dispute resolution, research methods in law and society, as well as a book called Cooperative Workplace Dispute Resolution. Some of these people are on Twitter. I encourage you to look them up. Some of them have faculty websites. I encourage you to look them up. They're great scholars in their own rights, and they're here not in their capacity as awesome scholars sharing their research, but in their capacity as colleagues, just talking about their experiences. So with that, let me turn over to the panelists and get the conversation started. Let me get the conversation started. And Swetha, I'd love to start with you, if that's okay. And you've been attending LSA conferences and other conferences for a number of years. And I want to ask you, how do you prepare for an interdisciplinary conference? Like, what do you do, if anything, like in the few weeks beforehand, and maybe even right afterwards, to make sure the conference goes well for you? Like, what do you do beforehand? Do you even do anything? What things come up for you before a conference?
I like that you asked, do you even do anything? It reflects a knowledge of me that I appreciate. Thank you. First of all, it's just great to be here. Good morning, everybody. This is my favorite conference of the year. I wait for the last week of May every year because it's my 13th Law and Society Association meeting. And every year I go, and it's sort of like in the summer, this is the piece, like my extended family knows what the last week of May is for me, simply because it's just where I am. These are my people. This is sort of where my books and articles and thoughts have evolved over the last many years. I'm very grateful for this community. What do I do? I think it's a little bit different depending on where I've been in the process. Mark said that a lot of what he did at the start of his career was just mimic his advisor. And I sort of definitely did some of that too as the start of this process. And as it happened, I was surrounded by a lot of law and society humans. And so my initial process was just sort of by, osmosis. Like I just went because they said, oh, you should go. And so I went. And then this was the first year. And I remember thinking, this is a bunch of really cool people. And it's a small conference. I know it doesn't feel small. I'm sure your first conference feels really overwhelming. But it felt really small to me, and the capacity to make it even smaller is what is really useful to me. And I mentioned this because the way I planned for this conference really is predicated on my intention to keep it as small and intimate as possible for myself. It's very easy to go to an academic conference, especially if you're an interdisciplinary scholar and you have multiple conferences you go to. It's really easy to feel lost in this process. And so for me, a large part of it is curating it to feel manageable and intimate for myself, right? And that this is a priority for me for a range of things, including my mental health, to just make sure that I'm going and actually getting something out of it that's useful to me. The last thing you need is one more thing to add to your academic year that makes you feel even more overwhelmed than you did at the start of it. And so this is sort of what frames my comment. So what do I do in answer to Mark's question? As soon as the schedule's out, I make sure I know all the things I absolutely have to be at, right? So if I'm a discussant, if I'm a speaker, I make sure I'm absolutely at that. Then I pick one other thing I will do every day that I really would like to do because I want to learn something from the field, right? And then I make sure I schedule and not just think about it, but I actually schedule something on the calendar for most days that will give me joy, right? It could be a coffee with a friend. It could be a walk in the bookstore. And it sounds silly, but I actually put it on my calendar. I say walk through the LSA bookstore. I mean, it's sort of harder to do now when it's virtual, but pick like one happy hour you want to go to, or one sort of meet and greet that your section's doing that makes sense for you. So planning and scheduling, that makes me feel like I have a little bit more control of this giant conference, even though it's not that giant. So planning a lot and making sure I have meals and chats and coffees with people or sidebars with people. That's the one thing I definitely do before a conference. And after a conference, I have to say, one of the nicest things about LSA is that you'll finish and you'll discover a new voice you didn't know from before, and you want to sort of follow them on Twitter, or you want to know what they're writing, right? You don't need to know everything about everybody, but be curious about who might be your next close friend. And this community has offered a lot of those chances at community and collaboration for me. So I really hope it does for all of you too. Mark, that was a super meta comment, but I know my colleagues are going to pick up on like more specific things too.
Yeah, that was awesome. So I'm hearing you say things about, don't just prepare for things, but also leave room for serendipity, leave room for the person you might see, presuming we go back in person, the person you might see in the hallway who wants to take you for a quick coffee, or the impromptu conversations that could be really generative. Omari, I'd love to ask, I'm actually going to ask all the panelists this question. I think this is really helpful even for me. So I want to turn to Omari. Like, what do you do? Do you do the same things that Swetha said that they do, or do you do other kinds of things to prepare, or maybe even what about afterwards, if you could comment on that? Is there anything you do after the conference besides like sleep a lot, which is what I try and do after a tough conference?
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. And hello, everyone. I think I would echo Swetha's comments in stating and underscoring the fact that LSA is my favorite conference as well. I feel like it's a community of interdisciplinary, like-minded scholars. It's super interesting. And I feel like it always sets the bar very high for me in all my conferences annually, and it's the one I most look forward to. So hopefully many of you will find that in your LSA experience as well. Something else I would like to underscore that from Swetha's comments is like curating your LSA experience, because I do feel like I am very strategic. Like Swetha, I outline, put on my calendar all the presentations or workshops I have to attend first, because you don't want to miss any appointments. And then subsequently, I search for scholars whose research interests me and maybe put their presentations or panels on my calendar. And then additionally, I kind of peruse the schedule and see if there are any panels or presentations that sound interesting, whether or not they're related to my research. Maybe they just pique my intellectual curiosity. And so I will have numerous events on my calendar, prioritized by the ones I have to attend. And then I just kind of let the day flow serendipitously, kind of like Mark said, making sure I attend ancillary panels or events based on scholars' work who interest me, or based on substantive areas that I'm interested in as well. And speaking directly to Mark's question of what I do post-conference, which I think is really important, right? Because oftentimes you'll meet people, scholars, colleagues at these conferences, and they may live, on the other side of the country, on the other side of the world, really far away. So I do try to send follow-up emails, especially with those folks who I've had the chance to speak with personally. And oftentimes, sometimes, you'll find that the people you follow up with, you'll run into them at subsequent conferences, or in a few instances, I've met scholars that have been within my geographic area, and I've been able to meet them for coffee or tea post-conference, and build those connections kind of organically in that fashion as well. So yeah, I think it's a number of things that you can do to like curate your experience in that fashion. But I'll turn it back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Beth, let me get to you in terms of what you do to prepare or what you do afterwards. I'll get to the question of what you do during a conference. I know, Beth, you've been to a lot of conferences. I know you're a part of many institutions. You've received awards from many institutions, the Midwest Sociologist for Women in Society, the Law and Society Association, the Industrial Relations Research Association, the ASA, American Sociological Association, LSA, the Law and Society Association. So maybe actually I could ask you then to let us know, like, I guess my question is, what do you not only do before and after a conference, but how do you treat conferences, or do you treat conferences differently, Beth? Is the ASA different from LSA, different from the Industrial Relations Research Association, or the ISA's Research Committee on Sociology of Law? Like, to what extent, how do you prepare differently for the different kinds of conferences? And the reason I ask that is because you, like everyone else in this room, I think you're especially interdisciplinary. You wear your sociologist hat, you wear your law and society hat, you wear many different hats in your professional career. And there's different kinds of conferences and maybe different ways of presenting yourself in these different, maybe some are more formal than others. So how does it work for you, Beth?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's a really good question. And if you talk to folks, different conferences have different personalities and different reputations too, sort of like people or institutions. So I do prepare differently. LSA, like many folks have already said, I think of it as my home conference. This is where I have a lot of friends from other institutions where you can catch up. But also because it's interdisciplinary, it's very, very stimulating. To contrast it with some other ones, Industrial Relations Research Association, which is actually now called Labor and Employment Research Association, is also very interdisciplinary. All different folks are doing stuff looking at labor and employment, but also they have a lot of practitioners, organizers, other folks who are putting some of the academic research right there into practice in the streets, various activists. So that's a little bit different. ASA, well, it says it in the name, there are a lot of sociologists, and it's a much larger conference. But within that, there's the sociology of law section and the crime, deviance, and law section, and a few other smaller sections. So for something that's huge like law, like ASA, I tend to look at my smaller area, my sections. I look at, a lot of times sections will have their own receptions, sections will sponsor their own panels. So I'll do that for ASA. For something like LERA, Labor and Employment Research Association, I might look at papers that are coming up and look at not just for an academic issue, but sometimes very much activist issues. LSA, all of that kind of comes together. One of the things that's neat is that I can do in some ways less preparation for LSA because there's the interdisciplinary synergy just really blossoms for me at LSA meetings. I can go to a panel that I think, oh, this is going to be great for this reason. And then there are more reasons that I find at this panel. There might be another speaker who I might not have originally thought of it, who opens up a whole other topic for me, or a different lens for looking at a topic that I thought of, that I've given some thought to already. So in terms of your question, Mark, how do I prepare for LSA in contrast to some other conferences? In some ways, I prepare a little bit less because LSA is already there, so organically for me, meeting those other needs. That said, I still do a lot of the things that are mentioned, just being in contact with folks that you want to meet for coffee, making those arrangements in advance, looking at the schedule and figuring out what days will I let myself go peruse the book sale. And also looking to look at what panels do I want to look for my own academic growth, what's going to just sort of intrigue me intellectually, and perusing what's out there. But that's less intense. I think for other conferences, there's more of a very intentional staking out the conference in a way that just comes much more naturally at LSA, which is why I think it's so wonderful.
So that's really helpful. I hear you saying things like, the bigger the conference, and I think LSA, if I'm not mistaken, the Law and Society Association annual meeting is usually around 2,000 or 3,000 people each year, which may seem big to some people, but if you compare it to some of the other big academic associations in the US, at least, like the American Political Science Association, the American Sociological Association, those are upwards of 10, 12, 14,000 people at a conference. And that can be really daunting, especially if it's your first conference or even if it's your 30th conference. And so people end up essentially finding their tribes through the sections, the organized sections. LSA has international research collaboratives in preparation for the Lisbon meeting in Portugal next year, which hopefully will be in person, depending on what happens in the world. There's also the various sections of LSA that that create panels for the conference. As LSA gets bigger, I think those sections become even more important for people. Fabio, could I turn to you in terms of this initial question that I'm asking folks about what it's like for a conference for you? You've been in conferences all over the world. You've presented LSA as one of many conferences you've been at and workshops that you've participated in. Maybe how does that work for you in terms of how you prepare? And then how do you see the role of these conferences in your professional development? Like, is it even worth is it worth us going to conferences? Do we have to do this? Because it can be pretty anxiety producing for me sometimes to present. And I would love to hear from you, like, how does it work for your professional development? Like, what do you get out of it really?
Thanks, Mark, for first of all, for your kind introduction in the beginning of this session. Thanks also, Greg, and all the LSA team for organizing this. You guys really deserve kudos for organizing this meeting, the second virtual that we have, and for trying to be innovative. And I think this panel comes out of that intention. I also want to greet my friends, Sweta, Beth, Jeff. It's lovely to be with you here. I think your question brought a number of issues, not only the preparation process, but also anxiety and the usefulness of the conference. I'm going to give you a first take on preparation, but already anticipating some of the other things that you asked about. In terms of preparation, I think I would repeat a lot of what others have said, but I wanted to make the point that in my experience, there are multiple conferences within a conference. I had times when the main reason for me to attend LSA was to give my presentation and get feedback that could help me improve my work. I had times when I went to LSA to actually attend a lot of meetings, to keep projects moving forward, to review drafts, to discuss where we would go with certain projects. And there were times when I just went to LSA to hear people and to see what the trends in law and society were, because I was in that kind of process of rethinking my own, research agenda, surrounded by data. There was a time when I worked for a think tank in Brazil, so I was not, routinely tied to theory and methodological discussions, but more surrounded by data. And I went to LSA. I looked at LSA as a source of ideas as to how I could look at the data that I was looking that could be innovative and that could add to knowledge and so on. But I think, looking at the program, finding people that you want to hear and learn about their work, drafting a plan, all these things are important. And in terms of following up, I think it also depends on what you're looking for, but I've written to people asking for references, right? Because they raise a question during your presentation and they speak about a certain framework that you're unfamiliar with, and then you want to learn more about that, and then you email this person and say, hey, can you give me more details about these debates that you mentioned? I've written to people asking them, inviting them to participate in events that I was organizing, to come to my institution and give talks, and so on. So I think these conferences, and maybe this helps to engage with the last part of your question. I think these conferences should be seen as places where we can understand who we are and where we fit in academic conversations, as places where we can deep exchanges and establish relationships and grow as scholars and individuals, but within a community that actually then extends beyond the conferences and leads to all these projects and interactions that we carry on further.
That's awesome. That's very helpful in terms of conferences being a space over time, not just to share your work and get feedback, which we all think, I'm going to go to this conference because I'm going to present a paper and a few people will show up and maybe I'll meet a couple of people. But you were saying, Fabio, it's actually a place over time to start meeting collaborators and colleagues. And, you use the conference because you all know you're going to be in the same place at the same time. You use the conferences to say, hey, let's get together and continue working on this project. Or I have this idea for this paper and you're working on this thing and I'm working on that thing. And why don't we come together? And since we'll be at this conference, let's have a coffee date together and talk about potentially collaborating on our work. I love how you said it's a place to understand, who we are and where we fit. A place to establish relationships and grow within a community. So I think that's very helpful. And that was a dog barking in the background, thinking that he's at this conference, but he's not. Swetha, I would love to turn back to you. I want to talk about Law and Society as an association is becoming more diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, global diversity. I love that in the chat there, so I think I counted something like 15, 16, 17 different countries represented in our panel this morning, which is pretty typical for a Law and Society Association event. Sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity. But there's still a super long way to go to reflect these realities in our scholarship and our conferences. I guess my question is, what's your advice on conferences? I know you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, but what's your advice on conferences and professional development to newer interdisciplinary scholars who maybe feel like they don't fit the mold? I know in many ways I felt like I didn't fit the mold when I was just getting started. And a lot of us feel that we feel like a little bit of like we're out of place. So what's your advice on conferences and professional development, especially to the newer early career scholars? Maybe something that you wish you would have known when you were getting started, when you said 13 years ago at your first LSA.
So one of the reasons I think LSA is so attractive is it's sort of, to me, what David Wilkins has this phrase for it that keeps coming back to me, this idea of the LSA as the island of misfit toys. It's like, like it's people who don't fully fit in other spaces come together and build a community. And we're like, yeah, this is where, like the true queers are going to hang, right? And I mean that in the most subversive, positive way possible. And part of what has worked, I mean, if I could go back and say something to myself, I guess 13 years ago, it's that just because you feel like you fit in this space doesn't mean that this is the only space. Like, this is not reflective of all the other spaces you're going to be in. It also lulls you into this sense of intimacy and security that doesn't get reflected in the rest of the academy, I think, right? Because you feel like, oh, I get to hang with these, well, not 2000, but like whatever, the 25 people you meet every year at LSA that you think of as your intellectual community. That's not often reflected outside in either your departments or your schools or your advisor coming back and saying, yeah, but this is not really what you should be doing, whatever that process is. And I think on the one hand, LSA offers a sort of oasis of capacity to hold people who are not full fits in other spaces. I definitely have felt like a misfit most of my career. It took me a long time to get my first job. I don't know if graduate students are here, but I did not get a job just out of grad school. I had a really long postdoc. And every time I went on the market, I thought to myself, this was going to, I don't know, like it would have been really easy to be, to feel like this wasn't going to work out for me. And truly, without LSA being the space that it was, that was like a mirror that reminded me that, no, there are parts of you that make sense, that we see you, that there's, and I don't mean the LSA as the association, but the humans I met in it and the people that I collaborated with. Fabian and I collaborated on a book that, one of the books that Mark mentioned at the start of the thing was literally out of a conversation in LSA. It's a 6-year conversation that happened over LSA that resulted in a book. It was a book that I couldn't have written that first year, right? But over 6 years, it became a thing that could produce a book. So part of, I think what I'm trying to say is, there's something about the process that asks for you to keep just showing up, and it has a life of its own that you can't probably predict. And it's hard to take that jump of faith, especially if you're a new scholar and you don't fully trust it, because why should you trust it? This is like a brand new space, and it's a virtual space. You don't know us. Like, we could just be selling you the Kool-Aid because this happens to be our home, right? But I think there's something about the process, because everybody is trying to find a home that's not fully curated, unlike other disciplinary associations, it is great. And for graduate students here, I just also want to make a pitch for how non-hierarchical in a really substantive way LSA is, right? Like everybody says they're not hierarchical, and as like a sort of queer from the global South, I identify as non-binary, sort of, I've had, and all of these identities I both wear lightly and heavily, right? Over the years, there are years when it's really important for me to present as X and like, be used, be called in a specific way and have all of these things matter to me. And then there are other years where I wear it much more lightly, where I'm just there, as, Fabio just said, to take a paper and see if I get good comments on it, right? So what you use it for can change year to year. But remember that part of what's useful about the space is that there are probably a couple of other people who share your solidarities and want to make community with you. But also the sort of general intellectual intimacy that's available to you within this community is really unlike any other community. I'm part of a lot of other associations, and I think everyone speaks the talk of non-hierarchy, but no one does it quite as well as LSA. So you actually feel like you're among friends, and it can lull you into a false sense of security, but in the long run, I'm here to tell you that it works out. And I'm happy to talk to anybody. This is only 1 hour, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about that process and feeling both lost and found within these processes.
So that's helpful. I appreciate what you said, that, the conference you go to, whether it's LSA or whatever conference the next conference that you go to, it's not the only space. Sometimes there are good conferences, sometimes they don't go as well for you. Sometimes you feel like you were really on and you're just exhausted afterwards. Sometimes you feel a little more relaxed during the conference. But either way, it's not the only space. There's going to be another conference. There's going to be another workshop that you could submit a paper to and potentially meet others to find your space, whether your space is, like Swetha said, whether your space is the misfits or whether your space is not the misfits. There's lots of space out there to find that. Could I ask the four of you, just before I turn to sort of the next question, I want you just each to quickly unmute yourself. When was your first conference? Did you go during graduate school? If you had gone to law school, did you go during law school? Were you an undergrad? Did you wait until you were, all of you were professors? Did you wait until you were a professor on the tenure track? When did you go to your first conference?
I mean, like 2 seconds ago when I became a professor? No.
So Swetha, that's been a while. You said 13 years.
Yeah, no, law school. I had just my last year of law school, I had a pre-doc and I went then.
Fabio, what about you?
2008 was my first LSA. I was transitioning between my master's and the PhD. So I've been
before you started your PhD.
Oh yeah.
Omari, what about you?
My first conference LSA was in 2016. I was in grad school writing my dissertation.
So you were advanced to candidacy. You were, I think that for me, that's probably my first LSA. I finished doing my first big conference. I finished doing field work and then I went to a conference. But I know a lot of grad students now are interested in attending conferences like from their very first year. Beth, what about you?
I went fairly early in my graduate time. My first conference was, I think, 96. And one of the things that was wonderful about my first conference was I also did the graduate student workshop. And so at that time they were separate, and it was wonderful because that was the 2 days before the conference. So I met up with folks who were also graduate students. And so we did our first, for many of us, it was our first Law and Society. And so we met each other a couple of days before, and then we did the conference together. In some ways, kind of like a little cohort effect. And now a lot of those folks are people I still meet for coffee, or I'll email with some sort of question sometimes. Many of us are still in contact and are still close. So that was, I think I went a little bit earlier. I went at the beginning of my data collection. So a couple of years before I was on the market. So when I was just starting as a dissertator. But that worked very well for me.
Yeah, so a lot of people, it sounds like during graduate school or even maybe before graduate school. For some people, maybe it's later. You'll find the right time, but depending on who you are and the conferences you want to go to and when they're offered and when you have a paper ready. Omari, could I turn back to you and ask you, if there's anything that you wish you would have known, is there anything you said your first LSA or your first major conference was while you were writing your dissertation, you were in grad school, you'd finished your field work in Brazil. I know you had presented at universities and other places. Is there anything you wish you had known when you were getting started? That like your current self, like the current Omari, wishes you could have told the past Omari when that Omari was getting started?
Yeah, I actually think I wish I would have known about LSA sooner. So my background, I come from a law background, and I'd like to say in a past life I was a lawyer, and I practiced law for about 9 years before going back to grad school for anthropology. So when I was studying anthropology, I was kind of like putting myself in boxes. I had a past life as a lawyer, and as a grad student, I had a current life as an anthropologist. And in my mind, my work was interdisciplinary, but as a young anthropology student early on, I didn't realize there was a community of interdisciplinary law and society scholars. I was unfamiliar with LSA, and I feel like had I known about a space like this sooner in my career, it could have helped shaped my intellectual curiosity in this direction, I think at an earlier stage, which would have maybe shifted my research probably for the better earlier on, I think. As I mentioned, I discovered LSA about the time I started writing my dissertation, which wasn't too late. But I think as a grad student, especially like going through coursework and the QE process and field work, being familiar with a community like this at an earlier stage could have shaped my thought process going through that graduate process, going through field work and informing my research questions, and that, especially when it comes to applying for grants, dissertation writing grants and so forth. I think being familiar with a community like this at an earlier stage could have been really helpful.
I didn't realize this would turn into a bit of an LSA love fest. That wasn't the point of today's session, but I'm glad that people, I should mention everyone here on the panel is a board or a current board member of the Law and Society Association, or former board member. That's how I was able to wrangle their participation in the panel today. But that's fine too. That's great too. What I want to do is turn to all of you. There's a number of you in the audience who've been patient. I know you have questions. I want to turn to all of you. Is there an experience you want to share, a question you want to ask the panelists based on something that they said? Is there something you want to know about what to help you as you progress in your career to make conferences more relevant and more helpful for you? And you can feel free to post your question in the chat as well, or you could use the raise hand function on Zoom. If you have the latest version of Zoom, if you click on reactions, and then you can click on raise hand. I see Tracy, your hand is up. Go ahead, Tracy.
Hello. This will be my first conference as a presenter. So what words of advice do you have for, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And my research kind of is in this Venn diagram of applied theater, theater of the oppressed, and of that legislative theater, and working with activist groups. So how do you kind of prepare to present when you are an interdisciplinary scholar and people may not be necessarily familiar with your research or your background?
Yeah, so I also see, thank you, Tracy, for that question in terms of the actual presentation. What do you do to prepare, and how do you pitch it, especially if you are interdisciplinary, like your audience speaks to multiple literature, or your work speaks to multiple literatures. How do you do that presentation? How do you prepare for it? How do you pitch it, especially at a Law and Society conference? Lillian Fialo in the chat also has a similar question in terms of what content do you prioritize when you have a limited amount of time in a presentation? What content do you prioritize? And how do you prioritize time as well to make sure you stick to time? One of my pet peeves in presentations is when the person says, okay, time's up, and then they're still talking, or they say, let me wrap up, and they go through the slides really, really quickly. And it shows that they haven't prepared for their presentation. And so we end up missing part of what they had hoped to share. So what do you do? How do you prioritize? Tracy's question and Lillian's question. Maybe Fabio, do you want to try that?
Well, I mean, I can say a few words, but I think I'll be connecting those with your earlier provocation about anxiety. And I don't know whether this could be useful to Tracy and to many people here, but I'm sure it can be useful to people from outside of the Anglo-American world. LSA has been one of my two conferences. I just come to LSA and to BRASA, the Brazilian Studies Association conference. But LSA was my first, and I freaked out. And not just for the first one, but for this couple of first ones. And one of the reasons is because, as I'm sure you've noticed, English is not my first language. In fact, I learned English very late in life. It has been my professional language these days, but I still don't feel fully comfortable expressing myself. Sometimes I lack words and so on. And so, I might misuse a term and so on. So that can be paralyzing, and I had to deal with that. But besides this, there's an issue of academic tradition too. I'll give you an example. Tomorrow, I'm moderating a panel. I'm serving as a discussant at a panel that happens in Brazil, my home country. And the panel is set up in a way where the speaker is going to talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and each discussant is going to have 30 to 40 minutes. And then there's another hour for people to react, right? And that's the normal kind of panel in Brazil. There's a different sense of time. There's a different sense of how you organize a presentation. There's a lot of, literature review rather than going straight to the data, as we see in North American conferences, especially LSA. So I had to learn how to navigate this, different world, and it was painful at times. As Sweta said, people at LSA are very nice and very good about understanding where we come from and being welcoming. But yeah, this is something that I experienced and that I had to deal with. But the best way to deal with was by doing it, and by disciplining yourself within this different canon that not necessarily is better than, let's say, the Brazilian one, but it's different, and I had to adapt myself. And I think this might be useful also to people, for example, like Jeff was saying, Omari was saying, come from law school, where the terms in which you articulate your thoughts are different from the social sciences and so on. I think that's a challenge that cuts across different disciplinary camps also.
So there are a few questions in the chat that I think are important. And here's where I want to draw on the collective knowledge of all of us. What does a good chair do in a conference, or a good discussant? Many of us have been to conferences and we've seen good chairs and maybe not so good chairs. Like what in a panel session, there's usually an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes, maybe 3, 4, 5 papers presented. And what does a good chair do? And I want everyone who's here, like, just put in the chat one thing you've seen before that a good chair does. I would say a good chair makes sure people stick to time and there's time for discussion. but feel free to add. And I want to ask you, especially Omari, I know you've been to a lot of conferences recently. Beth, you've been going to conferences, you said, for a really long time. Your first LSA was back in '96. What does a good chair do? Facilitate interdisciplinary ties between the papers. Absolutely. What else is coming up for you, Omari?
I think reaching out to all the panelists beforehand to like maybe request a copy of their papers or their abstracts and kind of like setting the guidelines and expectations for the panel. I think some type of communication before the panel is important. I think I'm always unnerved when I don't hear from a moderator or discussant before the panel. And, you know, because you don't know what's going on. Do they want your paper? Or, you know, are they going to read it? Are they going to give you feedback? Will you receive papers from the other panelists on your panel? So I think for me, like communication, pre-panel communication is a good idea.
Yeah, so setting up an email thread. And if some of you don't hear from your chairs, feel free to write to them if you see them in the program and say, you know, how would you like to proceed? I'm trying to plan a presentation. Should it be 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes? Like how much time do we have? When should my paper be submitted? Are we going to circulate it to everyone in the panel? Feel free to ask your chair if they haven't written to you directly. And others, feel free to put things in the chat in terms of things you've seen. A few of you have already done this. People, I'm not talking about Fabio or Swetha or Omari or Beth. Others of you who are here today, feel free to add things in the chat that you've seen work well to share your collective knowledge and wisdom with everyone else who's here. Just if you want to put some things in the chat of things that have worked well in your panels. Other questions that have come up.
Mark, could I just add
Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just add a thing that I put in the chat? And this year and last year especially, so normally I always write to folks on my panel and like we'll try to start a discussion because it helps you know who you're talking to. For those of you that are going to be chairs, it helps you know who you're talking to, but it also helps them sort of know each other before they're thrown together into this group. But last year and this year, I've also told people to not send me papers if like that's not where their heart and head is at right now. And I think that pause and like understanding of like where people are has been, I think, really appreciated. Like I have 3 panels on South Asia this year and sort of telling each of them that they do not have to think this is a deep deadline or a hard deadline to send me something, and that the point of it is to have that conversation, right? And to like be ready at years like this to also take that space, I think has been really helpful.
Yeah, so in some cases, especially in there's panels and there's roundtables, and oftentimes a panel discussion is more formal where people present, each person presents a paper and then a discussant ties the papers together or provides individual feedback, and the chair maybe sticks to time and keeps everyone on track. But then there's also a roundtable format where a bunch of people show up and have a conversation, and there aren't any formal written comments that are provided in advance, or it's just a chance to converse usually about research methods or new directions in a particular area of law and society. And that can be a chance for you to just kind of let go and say, you know, here's my research and I wonder how it speaks to things that, you know, so-and-so is working on. So those roundtable discussions can be really helpful. There's also plenary panels at conferences where, I guess on Zoom, those would be in more of a webinar format, where a group of scholars are talking about a key issue, maybe not with papers, but maybe in 10-minute sets of comments with provocations from a chair or discussant. I may have missed a few things in the chat, but please put your hand up if there are other, in terms of what other questions you have. Chiara Packard.
Yeah, hi. So first of all, thank you all so much. This is really helpful. I'm loving all the professional development seminars that are happening virtually this year. And I just had a question that probably more applies to when things go back in person, but if you all could speak a little bit about the norms and kind of expectations around reaching out to have coffee with scholars you don't know. Because I mean, of course, it is easy if you know them and you're like, oh, let's grab coffee to talk about our research or just catch up. But for someone that's new to the field and doesn't know many people, how do you kind of build those connections? And, you know, curious to hear what you all have to say.
Who would like to take that one?
I'll take it. I'm like the coffee human. And also it's Ramadan, so I'm thinking about coffee more than ever before. Okay, so writing to people you don't know, I think one of the things that's really helpful is to say something substantive about a connection. So it's not just like, it could even be, I saw your website, it's really cool. You study ABC, I study XYZ, let's hang, right? And also be ready to not take it personally if they say, no, I'm booked up, but can we do X, right? It's not about you. Often it's just about other coffee dates that they're trying to prioritize for their own mental health in life, right? Like, so I think it's worth remembering that you should reach out to folks and say, I'm going to be at this, you're going to be at this, could we do X? And then the chances are most people are going to say yes. I definitely try, especially with new humans that I haven't met before. Was that entire thing muted? Did you mute me? Mark.
No, just a portion of it. You're good.
Greg, I'm taking that so personally. But yeah, so especially if there's a substantive interest, I think humans do want to get together. So I wouldn't second guess and self-censor, but also I would not take it personally if someone says, I can't this year, because it doesn't mean they hate everything you've ever written, which I think, especially as a junior scholar, is so easy to internalize. When someone says no to me, I think it's because they've read everything I've done and they know I'm terrible. And I mean, they might, but just remember that it's probably just because they have another coffee on the cards.
A couple of questions in the chat. Let me just draw your attention in the chat. Isabel Arriagada, thank you, Isabel, for that comment you made in the chat about, like, look, let's be real. A lot of people, probably most of us, get a little bit of anxiety before we teach or before we present or before we show up at a conference. And Isabel suggested, you know, doing relaxation exercise or grounding exercises, which I think work for a lot of people. Another thing that works for a lot of people is just practice your presentation beforehand. And then when you get to the actual presentation, you tell yourself, I know I can do this because I did it yesterday. I did it yesterday in front of a mirror. I did it yesterday to my cat. I did it yesterday to my neighbor. Like, I know I can do this. There's another question in the chat about, you know, which presentations to attend. Do you go to ones that are right in your field, or do you go to ones that sound more interesting? My guess is probably a little bit of both, but let me see if others want to speak to that question as well as, you know, how you deal with the relaxation or preparing for presentations. Beth, I see your hand up.
Thanks. I'm not quite sure how to take the hand down, but I think you have that capacity, Mark. Yeah, I wanted to speak to that stress. And you know, when we go up to, you said a lot of us get nervous before we speak. When we go up to speak in front of a classroom, we're sort of the experts. You know, we are teaching, we are conveying knowledge to students, and we have to be really on. Although you definitely want to be on and prepared, and as Mark said, practice your speech often. I think it helps to think about an LSA panel as a conversation, because people are going to ask questions, especially, I think this is especially true when there are a lot of interdisciplinary folks together. You're going to get questions where you haven't thought about that at all. And you're like, oh, gee, that's an entirely other thing. Totally legitimate, totally brilliant. I have no idea how to respond. And that's marvelous. I mean, that's perhaps one of the best parts of it. But if you take it as you have to be the expert and be ready to correctly answer those questions, it's going to be really stressful. And that's not at all what LSA is. But if you see it as this conversation where people are going to come at it from different angles and are going to build on this really dynamic interdisciplinary conversation with you as you present and answer questions about your paper, I think that will be a lot more productive and also a lot less stressful.
Yeah, so think of it as a conversation. You're not just preparing, and it can be very helpful, even especially in the Q&A. Those can be the most exciting times in a panel. If you get a question in the Q&A that you can't answer, it can be helpful to say, I don't know the answer. And then flip the question back to the person who's asking, like, what do you think? Why did that question come up for you? Because it's not something I thought about. And that can induce that conversation. Fabio.
No, I just wanted to echo Beth in this. And I think this might be especially useful for people who come from well-established disciplines where there is an answer, right? or there must be an answer for a question. I think LSA is different because, and again, this leads me back to what I said before. Sometimes we don't know the premises of the question, right? Because we're not versed in that literature that the person is building upon to ask the question. And so in terms of following up, a lot of times I take from LSA this homework, which is to learn, more about these other viewpoints that I was ignorant about.
Yeah, I think that's we are about at time. And I think that's a nice point to close at, which is this idea that we don't know everything and we can't be expected to know everything. And that's the point of conferences, is we're there to learn. Academics is it's one of the few professions that doesn't have a continuing education requirement, partly because we are continuing in our education and constantly by reading others' work, by attending conferences. I think that's a big part of our own continuing education as we progress in our careers, whether you're a first-year graduate student and you're looking to branch out of your department, or you're a 25th year as a faculty member and you're tired and old and crotchety and angry and whatever it is, or happy. Either way, like, the point of conferences, I think, is just to keep learning with one another and keep supporting one another, especially others as they progress in their careers and pay it forward. I'm going to invite the panelists, if you're able to stick around for about 10 more minutes, maybe. I know some of you may have to go, but if you have to go, you have to go. But I'm going to go ahead and close the formal session because we did promise we'd stick to about an hour. And I think we've done that. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Law and Society Association. Thank you, Swetha, Omari, Beth, and Fabio for being here and sharing your wisdom and experiences with all of us. There are more than 100 of us who are here at the height. So thank you all for being here. I hope this was helpful for you. One thing I would ask is, before you go, if you want to throw into the chat one thing you learned from today, or one thing that you learned from just attending conferences, because many of you who are here, the 80 or so who are left here, have been attending conferences before or workshops. What's one piece of advice or one top tip that you have for others for conferences? If you want to throw that into the chat before you go for people to see, or write it in there to share your collective wisdom with one another, that would be great. Otherwise, I presume many of you will be attending the LSA conference, so we'll see you there in a couple of weeks. And I wish everyone the best at this time. Take care, everyone.